Veronika is a true artist. Her talents include drawing, verse, prose, and even spoken word. She is also resilient, surviving what many couldn't even imagine. One survival strategy she used was art therapy, and from this spawned the idea of her children's book, The Power of Art, When My Feelings Can't Talk, a wonderful story and activity book that helps children navigate their big feelings. Next came her poetry volume, From Embers to Ash. This is a collection of poems about heartache, transformation, and healing childhood trauma. Veronika bears her soul in this book and truly lives her words of healing it forward. She even leaves a note to the readers that says, "To those who have been to hell and back again, may you find solace in knowing you are not alone." I feel so incredibly privileged to have met and spoken with this artistic soul, and I'm sure you will feel the same after watching our conversation. Thank you, Veronika, for being part of the Indie Author podcast. Now let's get to it. Hi, welcome to Indie Authors. I'd like to introduce Veronika Childs today. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Oh, I'm wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to just go right into your introduction and give a little bit of background on you. So you're an author, speaker, podcast host, and mother of three. So you've got a full plate. And through your creative projects, you work to inspire others to make an impact, which is a beautiful thing to do. You hope to encourage readers to be themselves, serve others, follow their passions, and heal it forward. And we're going to talk about that, healing it forward, as we go along. And you've written two books. So The Power of Art, When My Feelings Can't Talk, which is a children's book, which I love. I was able to read it last night. And this book is all about Sammy, who is excited to show off the art in his new school special book, filled with happy paintings, sad paintings, and even silly paintings. Sammy discovers that it's okay to have emotions and to express his thoughts and feelings through all forms of art. It's a delightful rhyming story about discovering and expressing emotions through art that is sure to inspire readers to put their own feelings down on paper. And it's inspiring, and it's really well illustrated. So I want to talk to you later about working with illustrators and how that process went down. And then you also have From Embers and Ash. Did I write that down properly? Yeah. So
Yes.
This is a collection of poems. Oh, and we'll talk about that too, because there's two that really were so, to me, I mean, all of them were impactful, but two in particular that resonated. And so it's a collection of poems about heartache, transformation, and healing childhood trauma, exploring the complex themes of abuse, grief, loss, love, depression, mental illness, and healing. It is a raw and personal deep dive into the anguish and turmoil faced when we battle our demons. To the readers who have been to hell and back again, may you find solace in knowing you are not alone. And that's so beautiful and so important, especially in today's weird climate. So,
Absolutely.
So let's start about the background, your background.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I've been writing poetry since I was probably about 15, 16 years old. I really found my passion in it, and it kind of was an outlet. It wasn't anything that I ever shared with anybody, but when I was going through a lot of turmoil, as all teenagers do, that was the only way I could really express it, because for me, speaking to people about what I was going through was much more difficult. But writing it down was kind of a way of getting those emotions out in so that they didn't implode on me. As far as the children's book, I remember my very first book that I ever wrote was in first grade. It was about a little boy and a pumpkin, and they find each other because neither of them the little boy doesn't have a pumpkin and the pumpkin doesn't have a child. So they find each other and then spend Halloween together. And
That's
somewhere
so
in my garage, I still have it, and it's really cute, actually. When I read it, I was like, oh, it's adorable.
You should publish it. That sounds like a great story.
That would be cute, actually. My now 7-year-old is constantly coming up with little stories, so maybe I'll do like a little compilation for her and include that one in there. That would actually be kind of fun. But that's how I started writing stories, and I never really thought anything could come of it, honestly. And about 10 years ago or so, I started really diving into my past, which is unfortunately full of a lot of trauma, especially in early childhood. And as I was going through therapy, I was really struggling with being able to communicate my emotions. And there were a lot of repressed memories in there that I couldn't quite get out. And so my therapist, very wisely, brought out some paper and pencil. And during therapy, I would just sit there and draw. And for some reason, not only was it easier to talk about what I needed to talk about, but a lot more came through on the paper than I realized. And my current therapist also uses art. And funnily enough, I never told her about what had happened prior. And she's really good at finding the clues in the art that I could never possibly find. And then she points it out and I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Wow.
And so it's really interesting because it's not something that I would have ever thought of on my own. But once I found the power of it, the words for The Power of Art, that book, just came to me. And it was I think it was divine inspiration, because it was like somebody was telling me, like, more people need to know about this ability. To me, it's almost like a superpower. When you can't talk about what you're feeling, your body and your hand almost just seem to know what to say in a way that you can't tell. But the way it came out, it was like a children's book. And I had it on my shelf for a really long time. About a year and a half ago, I went to a writer's retreat, and it was just something that I saw on Facebook, totally out of the blue. I ended up going, and I found like this group of women who were all kindred spirits, and I showed them this book, and they were like, this is amazing, you have to publish this.
Yeah.
And
Good.
one of them was a therapist, another one was a teacher, and I was like, well, if they think I should publish this, and they were all moms, maybe I should listen. And so I started looking into it more carefully. And even though I was really nervous, the first person I actually showed it to besides them was my 7-year-old. And when I started reading it to her, she goes, Mom, kids don't use these words and this word, and you need to change this other thing because I don't know what that means. And so that taught me the value of a target audience, because I immediately changed those words. Obviously, if she didn't get it, then other 6, 7-year-olds were not going to get it either. And so that was my first lesson in, making sure that you actually have your target audience read before you publish. And so that process was one that took a while, because it was kind of like learning the ins and outs of publishing. And like you said, working with a designer and an illustrator. And originally I illustrated it myself. And then when I was done with it, I was like, okay, this book looks homemade. There are a lot of homemade self-published books out there, but to me, it was really, really important that I get it into as many kids as possible. And I know my kids, if they picked up something that looked like I made it, they wouldn't read it.
Yeah.
They want a professional book. So I went online, and I was really fortunate to find a book designer that actually works with a publisher, and she is from England, and she helped me find an illustrator. And that's how The Power of Art, When My Feelings Can't Talk, became professionally designed and illustrated. And it turned into a book that I knew kids would pick up and wouldn't necessarily know that a mom made it. It looks like it came from a store.
Oh,
which
yeah.
is exactly what I was shooting for.
Yeah, it's beautifully done. Like, it's so professional, and because it is professional, but it's and it's so engaging, and I like the different kinds of activities that you can even an adult can do, right? Like, I'm not an artist by any stretch of the imagination, so I feel like I could actually attempt to do some of the activities in there. What was the process like with working with, sorry, so the person who found the illustrator for you, they were in the UK?
Yes.
Was the illustrator, where was the illustrator?
Honestly, I don't know. I've
So
never
everything
talked
was
directly to the illustrator.
okay.
Because of the way, I guess that's the way I could talk to the illustrator. I'm sure she would be fine with it. I prefer to deal with one person.
Mhm.
So I communicated my ideas through my very rudimentary illustrations to the designer.
Okay.
And then she worked with the illustrator. They came back with some concept ideas. Originally, Sammy was a panda. Then we had to come up with a backstory for Sammy. And so the reason he's a polar bear is because, in my mind, polar bears are white and they're surrounded by white. So who would love color more than a polar bear?
Very smart, actually. That's brilliant. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the reason Sammy's a polar bear. And so just working with coming up with the concept art and then just seeing what she could do on paper, it was it was really, really interesting to get their feedback. For example, Sammy lives in an ice house, and I never would have thought of that myself. And so it was just a component of like, well, when does he see color? It would be in the spring, just it's it probably had more thought than it needed to have for a kid's book, but it was important to me to have all of these things worked out.
Yeah.
And and so that's kind of what it was like. Probably the most complicated process was trying to communicate feedback online, which was I'm such a hands-on person that I really would love to have been there and been like, let me point this out.
Yeah.
But once I figured out, I put it on my tablet, was able to circle some stuff, it was a process, but we're currently working on I wouldn't say a sequel, but kind of a sequel. And it's been a much smoother process now that they know what I like and I know what they like, how they communicate. And
So
so,
so I guess it's key to finding well, in any industry, it's key to finding a good group, right? But in this particular instance, because it's all virtual, like you have to find people who are like simpatico with your vision, or else it can be, I could assume it could be a very frustrating process, right? And
yes.
then I would think that would detract from not only the experience, but take the creativity down a notch because you're so focused on like the frustration. So your experience sounded like it was great. Were there points where you were like, oh, what am I doing? Like filled with self-doubt, or did you feel confident the whole way through?
I did originally, like when we first got luckily, the designer kind of worked with people before because she was actually the one that suggested, why don't we start with page plans
Mm,
and we'll do a couple test drawings. So rather than, go in full board like the first time and have all this money laid out and then not knowing what I'm going to be getting back, we started with page plans. So I kind of saw her vision for the illustrations and what it was going to look like. And I saw a lot of the works that she had done before. So I kind of saw what her final products would look like.
hmm.
And so I was able to say, like, I really like this page from this book that you did, could you do something like this with the art? Or could you do something like this with the words? And with the illustrator, again, it was very much, she did a test for me, not just with Sammy, but we also did she did my kids the dedication page. I don't know if you saw it, is actually my entire family when they were like 4 or 5 years old, including
I have
myself
to
and my
look at it
husband.
again. I didn't pick up on that because I dove right into the content. So
Yeah.
I'm sad I missed that, but I'll look again, and yeah. Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely.
Yeah, so it was important to me because I did at the time we didn't know if there was going to be actual children in the children's book. I actually like the way it turned out with all the animals because I feel like that's more relatable to kids because
Yeah.
then nobody feels excluded. Because originally I was like, okay, make sure we get it very diverse. I want to make sure that there's, every type of child there could possibly be. And then it started getting very complicated.
Yeah.
And so doing the animals, I think, was able, not only the cute factor, but also making sure that it was very inclusive of all types of children everywhere. Because to me, like I said, the message is very important. I think there's a lot of kids out there. If the statistics are to be believed, there's a lot of kids out there who are suffering that don't have a way to communicate what they're feeling. And so it was
Yeah.
really important to me to be able to reach as many of them as possible. I'm actually in conversation right now with the school district, and I love that you love the writing component inside the book because that actually was an idea that came from the moms in my writers retreat. They actually, the therapist and the teacher were like, kids love writing in books, like make it so that it's writable. And then when I was talking to the school district, they're like, oh no, it's writable. We can't put it in the library. So I'm like,
Oh,
oh,
right. Oh man.
because
Yeah.
it's a consumable book. So right now I'm actually working with the designer and the illustrator to fill in those pages to create like an academic version that could actually go in the school libraries.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but like I'm also working with the school district to figure out a way to make him so that I could come into the classrooms in the first, particularly the first grade classroom and the kindergarten classrooms, and talk to the kids about art, and then show them the book because it's they're like, we can't pay you, and I said, it doesn't matter, I just want to get the message out there. Like, it's that important to me. Luckily for me, I have other ways of sustaining my living, that it doesn't have to be this book, but I really, really, really care about the message, and so I'm so happy to be on here to be talking about it.
Oh, wonderful. You're our second guest. And the first one had the same sentiment. It was sort of like it had a diverse audience that could reach, but same feeling that she said, it's not about making money. It's about just getting my project out to the world. And this was more about something that I felt was necessary. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but so it's lovely to hear that, right? Because it's these are real passion projects when people are like, doesn't matter, I don't care, just as long as my message is getting out there. And after this incredibly complex time, I think it's important that people are taught or are encouraged to feel freer about expressing these big emotions that they have.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a whole new world after what we've just been through. I don't know if YouTube will like blank out the words, but I think everybody can get understand what I'm talking about. Because I see it all the time with I live in a condo. This is a condo behind me, and my friends in the condo, we're all sort of in the same spot. Like, what next? What have we come through? What's happening? And I know that children express things differently, but they probably, especially the ones who maybe had a little bit of schooling before, were taken out. It was all this uncertainty. And
Mm-hmm.
then, being isolated from their friends and isolated from their teachers, and then going back in, like, it's got to be really tough. And so there's probably a lot of emotions that they're feeling, but they can't express. So this is an important and a very timely book, I think. Yeah. So this is great. So you actually, because I'd like to see, and not that I want anyone to have a challenge, but we had a discussion prior to this about you having been pulled out of art to take English classes because English wasn't your first language. Um, and your experience surrounding that and how you overcame it and how you stuck with it and you are able to so eloquently express yourself, even though like you were disconnected from your passion early on for a little bit, and then I'm presuming you went back and did more art. So please share that experience.
Absolutely. So, as I was mentioning earlier, I did experience quite a bit of childhood trauma, and I wish I would have had art as an outlet then, because I remember um, I'm not a native English speaker. Believe it or not, Spanish was my first language, English was my second. And because of that, I started first grade not knowing any English. And so they would always pull us out of class. And it seemed like they always pulled us out of class at the best times, like when it was
Mm.
art or something cool. It was never during like math, although truth be told, I love math. But it was always during art. And I feel like that's true even today, that the very first thing that leaves schools, especially public schools, is art and music and things that help children express themselves. And that's so important. We're learning now that emotional intelligence is more important in a child's success than any other kind of schooling. And so to have that be the first thing that's pulled out is really, really sad. And so that's one of the reasons that it was important for me. And I know you mentioned, art being my passion. When I was a kid, I loved art, but I was terrible at it. So I never really did it that much because I thought it had to be good. Like
Right,
if I
right.
couldn't do it well, I didn't want to do it. And so now as an adult, I know. And what I always tell my kids, it's like, it doesn't matter what it looks like. If you're happy with it, just, scribble. It doesn't even have to look like anything. Even, an emotion can just look like a big blob. That's fine. And so I try to tell that to kids and pass that along, that it's really more about how it feels than it is about what it looks like when you're done. But at the time when I was a kid, I didn't have that outlet and I didn't have that knowledge. I thought, if I have to draw, it's got to look like, my family. It doesn't can't look like,
Yeah.
it can't just look like this big anger blob. And so
Finger plop.
that's one of the reasons that I want to reach out to kids is because of that experience that I had as a kid, that at the time I I wish I could go back and hug my little self, but I was going through a lot, and
Hmm.
nobody, including my immediate family, knew what I was going through. And had I been able to express that in another way, maybe I would have been able to tell somebody. Who knows?
Yeah. And I think there's an important message that you just said about people giving up because it's not how it's supposed to be, right? And I mean, I've been victim to that too. And it, if you look now, and this is the beauty of social media and this whole virtual world, that everybody has their own unique style, and there are followers for everybody's own unique style. And I'm thinking specifically, there's a gentleman that I saw, I can't remember his name, forgive me, but he completely doodled his entire house. I think I saw him on Facebook. So his house is one massive doodle, right? And it's all black and white, and it's very, very graphic look, not graphic like but like graphic design kind of vibe. And I lost my point of what am I saying? Oh yeah,
Everybody has
so
a style.
yeah, and so it, he might not be considered by others as being an artist because it's doodling, but then he is an artist because he's created, and that's the whole point. He's created an entire house. His house was everything in his house. Everything is doodled over, and so and people love it, and they respond, and they can identify, and they're like, I can doodle. I can, just take a black marker and do something on a page, and it's so inspiring because you don't have to be like a Michelangelo, right, to be considered an artist,
Right.
and I think it's important to set out the message that you don't give up, because with practice you become better at whatever your talent is and however that expresses itself. Writing is the same. You practice writing all the time, and you start to be able to develop like stronger imagery, or more compelling sentences, and deeper characters. So yeah, that is an important message. Just because you may look at your own work and say, oh, this is not great, or this isn't real, or whatever, that's that negative self-talk that's stopping you from that creative process. So
Right.
important message you came up with there.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Eh,
Sorry, go on.
no, I was going to say, and that's a good point when it comes to writing as well, because you think there's a certain way that it's supposed to look or that it has to be, and that's not true. And I found that out when I was doing my poetry book, which you mentioned, because there's a lot of messages out there about how poetry should look or what it should be like. But really, as long as you're getting your message across and it feels right to your soul, that's all that matters. And somebody
Exactly.
out there is going to resonate.
Yeah. And I mean, the beauty that's within, so let's switch focus now and talk about the poetry. And I'm looking down here because it's right here. I've got actually, I don't know if you can see. Oh
Yep.
no, there's like two. Okay. So because of all the lights, but pick up this, everybody out there, pick up this book, because even the interior is so beautifully done, besides the words, but just the images and the design is so impactful, I found. And it was a delight to go through, because it's not just a standard, like, a page that looks like this. I mean, that's obviously, you wouldn't publish a page that looks like that, but like a typical interior of a book.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I have the book right here actually. I can see if I can pull up one like something like that.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that was part of the experience, that it made it better, because you could approach it in so many different ways as a reader. You could approach it by looking at just the graphics that are in there. Then you could go back and appreciate the poetry, and then you put the two together, and then you ponder over, oh, interesting how this connects to this, or the use of, like, I closed it now, but the different graphic elements and how they relate back, or and it's very accessible, because if someone's intimidated by poetry, or they don't understand the concept, because poetry has a devoted following, and some people just are like, "Mm," and that's okay that
Yeah.
right, but this is a treat to even people who may not uh fully understand the concept of poetry because you've added this extra value, let's call it, in this extra value age of beautiful design within. So you worked with a designer on this one too?
Actually, the same designer who did Sammy's book did this one.
Yeah,
Because I
incredible
asked her,
work.
I said, "Do you know anybody who designs poetry books?" And she said, "I can." So she sent me a couple test pages, and I was like, "This is genius. Okay, let's do
Yeah, so
it."
genius. So you guys are a great team because I was beyond impressed. Yeah,
Thank you. I
it's
appreciate
beautiful.
that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And the words are beautiful and very impactful and very um personal, like gut wrenching. And there's a lot that I can identify with, which then made me pause to think like, okay, why is this like you had said that, and we'll talk about this later, this visceral reaction when you published, but I also had this visceral reaction while reading, and it was like, okay, what is triggering this? And so there was a lot of self-reflection while I went through, which was, I mean, poetry tends to do that. Well, good poetry tends to do that. Um, uh, but I don't think I've connected as powerfully with poetry before. Maybe like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, is that her middle name? Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I'll have to double check. Yeah, that was another one, even though I can't remember her name right now, who I sort of had that same feeling with, but not much else since.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so you did an amazing job. I mean, I'm going to have another poet on, Charlie Petch, whose poetry also it has tremendous meaning behind it too. But you know, it's when you find someone that you can connect with, and especially I always applaud poets because you guys like use so few words to express such huge emotions, and it's always just so inspiring, and I'm always awestruck that someone can capture so much in just a little, and not I'm not just saying, oh, just a little, you know, because there's so
Yeah.
much meaning, but in such a small amount of space. So yeah, so
Yes.
kudos to you and all the
Thank
poets
you.
out there. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
incredible.
That means a lot to me, and it's funny because it's something again that I almost didn't publish. Um, I keep mentioning it, but that trauma piece again. I was really struggling a lot with my emotions and my trauma, especially over this past summer. And I ended up joining a group program that was for trauma survivors. And so we were working through coping skills and things like that. While I was there, we would be having what is called process. So, like group therapy, basically, and going through all these emotions. And then, we're all, and so I would just, something would pop to my head and I would write it down. And then the next time we had a break, I would be sitting with my now friends around the table and I'd be like, I just wrote something. Can I read it to you guys? And at first I was so shy to read it, but three of the people that were there were musicians and they started like writing little songs together. And so them sharing their lyrics kind of gave me the gumption to share what I had written. And when I started reading it, like people would just be floored. Like I would literally see their jaws drop. And it was such a impact on me to see the impact on them. Like I never realized that my words could have that kind of impact on anybody because I'd never shared any of my poetry and I'd been writing it since I was 16. And the more I shared, the more they said, "You have to publish." And I said, at the time, I was like, "No, I don't. Nobody else is going to want to read this." But literally, people would be coming in and out of this group. And every time somebody heard one of my poems, they would be touched in a different way. And it was almost as if they came to mind for the person that needed to hear it. It was really eerie the
Yeah,
way that happened,
yeah,
but it did. And when while I was going through that program, Sammy's book published, and once I found how, I wouldn't say easy it was, but the process and how not extremely difficult it was to publish that book, I started thinking more and more about it. And so finally, while I was at this program, they decided to do a talent show. And at this talent show, like at first I wasn't going to do it, but one of my friends there, he likes to direct different things, and so he was directing this talent show, And he's like, you have to do it. So he's like, I'll coach you through the whole thing. So he coached me through learning one of these poems, like to be able to perform it, which is an entirely different experience. So
I bet.
nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
But I got up there and I was looking at my little note cards, like shaky like this. And I did the poem. And when I stopped and I looked up, the entire room of like erupted in applause, because
Oh,
most of the even the staff, like most of these people had never heard this particular poem because I hadn't shared it yet.
right.
And like 4 or 5 people came up to me and said, let me know when you publish. I have to know, I have to have this poem. And so that was when
So you
I
had like a
finally
built-in
said,
audience already. Like it, like that's incredible. Good for
yeah.
you. Yeah.
And so it finally was like, okay, I need to publish. I need to publish because there's more people like me. There's a lot of my personal story and emotions in these words. And I realized what an impact that they could have on other people, especially other people who have had similar histories as mine, or at least those similar emotions in their childhood, or even in now their adult life. And for me, it's always been a calling. I started sharing my trauma story on podcasts about a year ago, um, because it deals a lot with, we don't have to touch on it here, but it deals a lot with like sexual abuse, especially like incest and things like that, things that people don't talk about because it's very dark and deep, and it's kind of in the shadows, which is why it's perpetually perpetuated because
Right.
nobody
Exactly.
talks about
Because
it.
nobody talks about it. Exactly. Yeah.
And so, like, a perpetrator's best friend is silence. And so I started sharing my story, and I said, you know what? These poems need to be out there in the world because there's people like me who are suffering, who think that they're alone because nobody ever talks about this stuff. And especially like the very deep, dark emotions that go with it. Because it's
Hmm.
really easy, well, at least for me, it's become easy. I shouldn't say easy. It's less complicated to talk about it on a big, broad basis like I did just now than it is to talk about it in a very specific, this is the way it feels inside your heart and
Yeah.
your soul kind of basis.
Hmm.
And when you hear the words and you see the words and it feels like that's what's in your heart, it's a lot easier to relate and realize that you're not by yourself. And so that's why I finally said, I have to publish this.
Hmm. Yeah. I really like what you just said about how the readers brought, there was basically that it was like divine intervention, that a poem that you wrote resonated, and it's interesting how you, a writer, or a poet or an artist or a songwriter, creates a series of images, either with paint or with words, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like a scaffolding or a foundation that you then release out to the world, and then people start constructing their own meaning or their own experience surrounding those words. Isn't that's just like, it's so mind-blowing to think about that. And I just had that image in my brain that your poems are out there and people are like layering their own meaning on top of it, and everyone's connecting on such a unique, different level. It would be fascinating to do a project of, if you had a group, let's say, and you provided a poem and then asked people to start interweaving their own thoughts and have this writing project or even an art project to see what comes of it, to see how your words inspire and then start to blossom in other people's lives. Like,
Absolutely. That
yeah,
would be amazing, actually.
yeah.
It's funny
Maybe we
because
should
after
think
I,
about hosting something like that.
that would be cool.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it would be more powerful if somebody else hosted it because if I did it, I might influence the audience. But
Yeah.
you're absolutely right, though, because I remember thinking after I published, thinking, what if like someday, like an English class is looking this over? Like, what would they think? Because one of my favorite things to do in
Yeah.
English class was American literature, where we would like literally analyze all of these classics. Not to say that my book's ever going to be a classic, but when we analyzed Edgar Allan Poe, like, did he know he was going to be a classic
Right. Right.
when he was writing?
Yeah. And I'm thinking back to professors that I had in university, and we'd be analyzing stuff of long dead people. And and they would say it with such authority. Well, this is what this means. And I was like, but does it, because do you really think that they intended for it to be this, or they just were like, oh, this sounds good. Out to the world. Bye-bye. So it's
Well,
funny that you mentioned that, because I think that often, like, we don't really know unless the person's there to ask. And at half the time, I bet it's like, whoa, I didn't know that. Or, yeah, I totally knew that. And they're like, no, I didn't. I absolutely didn't. I didn't intend
Or
that.
it could be, yeah, it could be something entirely different. Like one of the poem that I recited for the entire group, one of the patrons came up and told me like, "Oh, I love when you said this and this. It's to me, it sounded like it was about this, this, and this." And in my mind, I'm thinking, that's not what it was about for me. But I'm glad that was it for you. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it was equally as deep, but slightly different. And so you're absolutely right. That's one thing that I love about poetry and any art in general is that people see what they want to see in it, but that's what they needed to hear.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. So, back to the next thing you had brought up, feedback is essential, and getting feedback from your intended audience or who you think your intended audience is. What other tips would you have for someone who is uh, completing their first draft or second draft of a project, and they're like, okay, now what? What's the next thing that helped you?
Absolutely. I think like I said, the feedback from your target audience is essential. Start with that because you'll never know what they're going to say. But that being said, get multiple feedbacks because you don't want to rely on one person. You might think that they're your target audience and then they come back with this feedback that doesn't resonate with you.
Mm-hmm.
It's still your project. Like it's
Yeah.
still your heart that you're putting out there. You don't want to change something that was super important to you because there's a reason that it's on your heart.
Mm-hmm.
Like I feel like the things that feel that deeply to us are there for a reason because it's something that we either need to communicate or do, or it's part of like the fiber of our being.
Mm-hmm.
Besides that, editing is a huge thing, not just like self-editing, but getting someone to professionally edit. I think that's one thing that a lot of self-published authors tend to skimp over because it's not exactly a cheap thing, but it's a super important thing. You never know what you're going to miss, especially if it's a story. The developmental editing can be very expensive, but super important. For poetry, it's a little trickier because you don't want somebody that's going to heavily edit poetry because it's very personal and deep.
Right.
But you
Yeah.
definitely want somebody who's going to catch like errors.
Right. Yeah. I guess that's a whole subspecialty. Someone
Hmm.
who edits poetry, because you're right, and you may I see tons of poets manipulate words even because it looks good on the page, but it may not necessarily be grammatically correct. So how do you even approach editing? That's fascinating. I'm gonna make a note of that to research that because I'd never even thought about that, editing poetry. Okay, anyway,
Yeah.
continue, please.
The way I worked with the editor that edited my poetry was they literally like they would comment on it and say, was this word this way on purpose? Because
Oh yeah,
there's
okay, that makes
very
sense.
there's a lot of homonyms like bear, bear, and bear. Like which one did you really mean? Well, I meant all three. So
That's why it's there.
exactly, which is why it's misspelled, but it's not misspelled. It's that way on purpose because it's supposed to be like bare your soul. Um, but so there's that component. And then there's the component that I didn't even thinking about until I was published. And that's the oh my God factor after you publish.
Like,
I
oh,
did
I've done
not
it.
think
Oh
about
my gosh.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Sammy book, I published that and it felt really, really good after I published. I was like, it's done, bright and shiny, and everyone's gonna see this. I published the poetry book and I really thought about, like the people in my group and, they've all heard my poetry. It's all good. They're going to all buy my book. I thought about, okay, the stranger who's going to pick up my poems and think, wow, this isn't really important. I really didn't think about the very close family members that are going to be buying
Oh,
my poetry going,
yeah.
Veronika,
What's
I did
happening
not know this
here?
about you.
Yeah, do we need to have a discussion?
Exactly. We need some serious therapy here. Um, After I published the book, I kid you not, I was like insanely sick.
Hmm.
I think it published like on a Thursday. I was sick Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday until Tuesday when I saw my therapist. And I mean sick as in like throwing up, visceral, I can't get out of
Really?
bed, sick. Yeah, it
Oh,
was bad. I would stand up and my whole world was spinning. And I had experienced this before due to a very large different trigger. And so I knew what it was. I knew that it was psychological. Had I not known, I might have ended up like in the emergency room
Right.
because
Yeah,
I was
because
feeling that sick. And it was
wow.
just like this visceral response to what are people going to think? What are they going to say? And it wasn't until I was able to calm down. Thank you, therapist. And really think about it. Would I have changed it? No.
Hmm.
Would I have not done it? No. So does it matter that it's out there? Well, it matters to me, but I still would have done it. And that was the most important part. Like, okay, so family's going to see it, maybe think of me slightly different, but maybe it's a conversation we need to have. So
Wow.
I guess be prepared for that kind of reaction because especially if you're publishing something deeply personal, that there is the personal fact that I didn't necessarily account for. I thought I had looked at it from all angles. I didn't quite, but I still wouldn't have changed it. So
That's interesting too, that you had anticipated so many different angles, but not the big one, right?
yeah,
Where family. And
yeah,
it's interesting because I hear that a lot, like, oh, I edited this out because I was concerned about what friends and family would think. But how empowering is that? That you're just like, eh, this is my truth. It's out there. And I mean, yes, I feel terrible that you had such a emotional reaction, and that is a complete proof that emotions can cause illness. I mean, we people are starting to accept it now, but people would say, oh, what are you talking about, right? Like
yeah.
before. But that do you have a sense of empowerment or of a little bit of freedom or something like that since getting that out there, and you're like, okay, this is my truth, bye, like it's out in the world?
Yes, in fact, and I thought, like I said, I thought I was over that because I have shared my story like from beginning to end on podcasts before. It's very different when it's like your own personal feelings, I think, rather than like the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that was the component that I hadn't thought about, just like the how deep in my soul these words came from. And that now people that I knew on a completely different level were going to see them. But it was freeing to know that, like, there's really nothing you don't know about me now, like,
Right.
and I even, oh, it's funny because I posted my Sammy book on my Facebook page, and then I posted it on my family as a whole, like WhatsApp chat, family chat, like cousins and everybody's on here. And so I posted it there. When I did my poetry book, I uploaded it and published it, and I didn't put it on my Facebook page. And then, like, a couple days later, I finally did. And then I was like, I put it on my family WhatsApp, but I put on there like the caveat: do not buy this unless you want to get to know me on a very deep level. you know? So I don't know if anybody actually bought it, but yeah, it was one of those things that because the message was so important to me, I wouldn't change it. But it's definitely something you want to look at when you're publishing. In fact, it wasn't until I started writing fictional stories that I realized how much authors put of themselves even into fiction. And I have a fictional short story that's being published by somebody else in April. And when I finished writing that, I was like, oh my God, there's so much of me in this character that like it's totally unintentional. But now that I read through it again,
Which makes
wow.
sense, right? It
Yeah.
does make sense in a way, because it's either going to be characters are either going to have something about the author or something about somebody the author knows, because you just leaks in, like it just happens. So but that's another fascinating topic here, is that you have straddled genres, right? So children's book, poetry, now a fiction novel. So I can't wait. You'll come back and we'll talk about that novel once it's out. Definitely.
Absolutely.
Because that's so exciting. And also I would be interested to see what your experience of publishing the novel is, as opposed to what you've gone through with these guys. So let's save that for when you return, because that'll be
Absolutely.
an interesting topic, because again, it just shows people you don't have to stay. You don't have to, just because you started with one thing, poetry, children's book, doesn't mean you can't branch out to other things. Like if you've got a talent and you've got messages, get it out there, right?
Right. And they're
So
each going to reach different audiences, which I think
exactly.
is cool.
Yeah, totally. And in especially if it's along the same line, but you've gone, and I'm not suggesting that because I don't know what your novel's about, but if you have an important message that you really want to get out there, why not like weave it into all sorts of different types of finished products, right? Um,
Right.
so the life after publishing now, what is that like? Have you been doing marketing? Like what, I know you said that you've been contacting schools and things like that, but for the poetry, what have you been doing in terms of that?
That's interesting because that was another thing that I didn't necessarily think about beforehand is that life after publishing. So there was the whole getting sick component, but now it's really just figuring out, like you said, how to promote these books. So with Sammy and the kids' books, I'm concentrating on, the schools, and I'm talking to Barnes and Nobles to see if we can do like some sort of activity. And I have um, coloring pages that I'm having made and things like that for that. The poetry book, it's been interesting because it's such a very specific genre. It's not something that I can go to like a Christmas event and just sell this book.
Right.
It's a little dark.
Can you imagine?
um,
Everyone's like got these Hallmark Christmas stories, and you're like, and here's mine. Enjoy.
yeah, exactly. For your very dark Christmas, when you go home to your family. Totally different message you want to share with your family. But so for that one, I've actually been talking to local coffee shops and Barnes and Noble again about doing like a poetry night. So like an
Oh,
open
wonderful.
mic poetry night. And then I honestly haven't started promoting that as much. I belong to a lot of trauma specific and emotion specific Reddit boards
Mm,
and Facebook groups. A lot of them have a no promotional kind of thing on it. So I haven't been promoting there, but just talking to people that I meet there and letting them know that I've published a poetry book, or sharing individual poems that might not even be in that book in those groups, just so that people can kind of get a taste for what I write,
mhm.
so to speak. Both of them are so important to me on a very personal level that it's been a bit of a challenge trying to figure out the best way of doing it. And I think what I've learned most is not to look for the best way of doing it, because if I keep looking for the best way of
Yeah,
doing it, I'm never actually going to do
you have to
anything.
just do it. Yeah,
just do
yeah,
just do what I can each day
yeah.
and go from there. And one of the things that I was floating around in my head is maybe sending copies of the books to people who I know are influencers in those specific genres. So people that work with moms, or people that work with other trauma victims, or that at least post that on social media, that might be interested in reading something like that. So that's kind of what I've been playing with, but I'm just out there learning, just like your audience probably is, still trying to figure out what to do after publishing. I think one of the things that I keep in my mind is that I've accomplished the most difficult part, which is actually doing it.
Right. Yeah.
That book forevermore is going to be out there. I don't have to sell 1 million copies today.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I had spoken to somebody else about the fact. Sorry, my dog is like, I want to be part of this conversation. Um, I'd spoken to somebody else about that fact, that the book now has a life. Like it's not it's out there, it has longevity, so you don't have to, it's not a race, right, where you're like, I mean, some people are driven by that. They're like, I want to get X amount of sales by this time, and this is my goal, and they do that for marketing so that they can gauge, if they've spent money on marketing, then was it worth the money. But others are like, it's there, if I don't promote it today, I can promote it tomorrow, but it's available, and anybody who stumbles along onto it along the way, that's great. And word of mouth and things like that. But yeah, it's not like all of a sudden it's like the old days where something goes out of print. Like, I don't
Right.
know if Amazon retires titles. I don't I wouldn't think so. I mean,
I don't
maybe
think so.
that's another good thing. So do self-published books go out of print? I guess maybe if the author either sorry, I'm making this note, go out of print. If the author removes them, but do they have an expiration date?
That's
Interesting. That's an
interesting.
interesting
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
I know you
Um,
can remove them, but I don't think they go out of print otherwise. Then again, Amazon hasn't been around all that long. I mean, they
true.
have, but
Yeah. It's still sort of a
not.
social experiment too, in a little way with the publishing and that sort of thing. But what a great opportunity. It's given so much power to people who were powerless before and who were at the mercy of finding an agent, a publisher. Like it's really, as much as people are like, oh, Jeff Bezos
Yeah.
and down with the millionaire or billionaire, in fact, um, the tool itself has really revolutionized things, and you no longer have to go to a vanity press. You no longer have to, because they were expensive. They charged you to print the
Hmm.
material, and you had to buy a certain amount, and you can have that discussion about vanity presses and the merits and the downfalls of going with them. But I think services like Amazon, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be a lot more coming out for self-publishing. I mean, I know that there have been, but this is the biggest one,
Right.
Amazon right now. But yeah, no, this is wonderful. So okay, so my question was, what's next for you? But you answered it because you've got this novel. And so what stage is it in right now?
Right now, it's not a full novel. It's a short story.
Okay.
It's a fantasy short story that actually belongs as part of a like a book series that one of the authors at that writers retreat actually wrote. And so what's funny is he has book one out already. Book two is coming out in April. And so the stories that I wrote and some other members wrote go between the two novels. So they fill in the audience on what's been happening between the two novels with side characters that weren't
That's
originally
amazing.
in the story. Yeah, so it's kind of fun. It's
That's
almost like
amazing.
fan fiction,
Yeah.
but we created these characters, and so now they're going to be part of his second book, which is really cool. And so that's coming out in April. For my own personal thing, I have another poetry book coming out that's going to be like kind of the opposite, the yin to the yang of this book. It's going to be on the much lighter side, on the other side of healing, the transformation that happens when you go through all of that anguish and work through it, and then kind of the turmoil that happens and the development that happens as you transform.
Hmm.
And so I think for a really long time I was stuck in that anguish part. And through all of this writing, even I think writing was a lot of the cathartic part of it.
Hmm.
I was able to kind of transform how I feel on the inside a little bit. And I want readers to be able to kind of go through that transformation with me, or at least see what it feels like on the other end. So when they're
Hmm.
stuck on one end, they know that there's hope, there's light at the end of the tunnel. Um,
It's very important to have books like that or things like that out there because again, it doesn't it makes people feel that they're not alone, that someone and maybe you can inspire someone to go get specific kinds of help or at least even research how to help oneself. Maybe, they don't want to go through a professional route, but perhaps they want to just do some self-improvement and confront these things. So yeah, it's, I mean, and a lot of what you were saying actually about the writing a personal story, you did it through poetry, but could apply to memoir as well, right? So
mhm.
these tips could apply to someone who is contemplating, maybe they're not poetic, but they want to um, tell a story. And so they choose memoir as their way of communicating it. And the same kind of considerations. How much do you put in? What do you do? Do you warn people? Do you say, yeah, don't buy this? You specifically don't buy don't buy this, nor any of your family. Um,
Yeah. I
yeah.
would say, I would say to your listeners out there, when you're thinking about publishing, listen to your heart.
Hmm.
If it's a message that your heart wants you to tell, then it's supposed to be out there. I think our brains have a way of telling us to filter ourselves and making us scared about what people will think and what people will say when it's finally out there. And by all means, there are times that that needs to be considered, but I think we think it needs to be considered a lot more than it actually does.
Hmm.
Because if we feel it, at least this is for how it is for me, if I feel it in my heart, and it comes out naturally in words because I don't force it, then it's meant to be heard by somebody. Like before we started talking today, you mentioned 2 poems that really touched you. I've had other messages from people, like this poem really spoke to me. It's always a different poem and it's always in a different way.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that different people were meant to hear different messages and they heard it in a way that was important to them. And I think that's true in fiction, in memoirs. I can't tell you how many books I've read that I've read it and it's just like hit me on a level that I don't even know the author intended, but it was like, wow, this book just changed my life. And to think that my words could possibly do that for somebody is astounding. And so I think there's a lot of people out there who want to share a message, who have a message to share and are afraid to share it. And I want to tell them, listen to your heart, not your head.
Yeah, because like I said, if you're feeling it, if you want to create it, there's going to be someone else out there who will appreciate it or who absolutely needs it, who needs to hear those words or needs to be inspired by what they're seeing, or there's always someone who can relate on some level. And it's just about being open and communicating those experiences. So I too, mean, I've had some health trauma, and whenever I have opened up, and it's like you said, it's like divine intervention. You just are in conversation, it comes out, and then the other person's like, oh my, I just went, or I know someone. And if we were all just more open about our personal experiences, and not so guarded about being vulnerable, I think that we would be in a much better state in society, and we wouldn't be so divisive and all the things that you see right now in politics, in social media, and in all different areas of life. And instead, we would truly be able to become a much kinder and more collaborative society on a whole. I mean, of course, there's communities that are like that already, right? Like I've met amazing people in writing communities, in volunteer positions, things like that, even in my places of work in the past, that are like-minded and just want to help each other genuinely. But unfortunately, there's always going to be groups that just want to tear people down. But yeah, you've got a really important message, and you should absolutely continue to put it out there to the world and make a difference. Just like you said, right? You want to heal it forward. And I think that's such a beautiful expression, and you completely embody it. Like you can feel the kindness and the desire to help, like coming off of you in waves, and the genuineness of your whole person. It's been a pleasure to get to know you a little bit more through this, and to have you here. And like I said, I absolutely want you to come back when the short story's ready. So, and if your pals if you want to do like a joint one where there's a multiple meeting with the other writers, like that would be so fun too. But yeah, I'm rooting for you, because you've got such a unique voice and such a kind intention for your work. So it's a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
Oh, you're welcome. So I'm going to post down below links to your work. And also, did you want me to share your podcast as well? Would you like that down there?
Sure, we can do that.
Okay. So I'm going to put that down there. So if anyone's interested, you can just click down below, wherever that down below is going to be. And you can listen to the podcast and buy the books, buy the children's book for yourself and for kids that Christmas is coming. This might actually be out after Christmas. So so any big event, whatever you celebrate, buy those books. Coming. Exactly. Birthdays are happening all the time. And even just for the heck of it gift. And also the poetry is really beautiful. And I think it's if you know someone who's having any sort of tough time or coming out of a period of trauma, whatever that trauma is, right? And it could be, and that's the thing about trauma, is that anything can cause trauma. Anything can, and it can be so profoundly damaging. And it doesn't have to be an enormous event. It can just be something that happened quietly. and that the person
Yeah.
suffers from it. So I think that there's great value to reading the poetry and identifying where your points of trauma are and how you move past it and grow as a human being and become better. Like not let that
Absolutely.
trauma drag you down, just grow from it and be better. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. And what a great conversation. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome.